Hey guys, it's Navinat on No Limit Hold'em, and welcome to part 6 of the Overpowered Poker course. In this sixth part, we're going to take a little bit of a break from our play on the flop. I was doing a kind of a basic course or a quasi-basic course for not beginners necessarily, but for players who wanted to learn how to really be good at poker in a kind of structured way. I got a lot of requests for that kind of a thing. Like, I know I want to study poker, but I don't know what to study or in what order, and I find myself bouncing from thing to thing. And so I decided to make this OPP course to try to keep people on a good path. And one of my students, or actually ex-students, no, I guess I'd say students, he's asking for a session again, said that it reminded that he didn't like the idea of or he didn't agree with my calling OPP a beginner's course. He said it was something more akin to beginner's math or fundamental math for people who want to teach math rather than like a basic math class. And I kind of said, like, fair enough. This isn't a beginner's course on how to solve EV equations or like how to do pot odds or count outs or anything like that. It's a little bit more probably complicated than that is, but it is still fundamental. This is stuff you do need to know to reach somewhere near the higher end of the spectrum when it comes to understanding No Limit Hold'em. And that's really what I've always tried to teach, is not just how to play, but how to really conceive of. I've never been particularly interested in telling people about metagame trends or what's popular, what's standard and what's not standard. More I've been interested in helping people to get their minds around the real kind of fine structures of game theory as it applies to No Limit Hold'em and GTO versus exploitative poker play. That was kind of a cool little transition, wasn't it? So today, we're going to take a little bit of a break from that. We're going to come back to it, because honestly, it was boring the shit out of me. I mean, I know it's necessary, but I think people are getting a little bored with it. I'm boring the hell out of myself listening to it. So I want to kind of wait until I get some kind of inspiration to finish the series. I mean, it's not going to be like a month out. It'll be next week or something like that. I'll do the next installment. But until then, we're going to talk about something that I think is a lot more interesting. And I know I could do an entire series on nothing but playing draws, but we're going to just do a quick video on playing draws, so we're going to have to stick with this basic definition of a kind of standard draw. That is a hand that doesn't have a lot of showdown value right now, but has a pretty good chance of improving to a very strong hand if the right cards come off on future streets. Now, remember, this definition, I think most of us would agree that this is a pretty good and reasonable definition for a draw. And this is the definition of a draw that you'll see on Navinat's line, the relative hand value line that I use, that has from left to right nutted value, showdown value, draw, error. And on the poles, you've got incentive to be aggressive, and then in the center, you don't have incentive to aggress, and people that play very loose and passively will pull you over to the left-hand side of the spectrum, and people that are very tight and nitty will pull you over to the right-hand side of the spectrum, and people that are very loose and aggressive will pull you in towards the center of that line. But that's only going to be really accurate when you define a draw just like this. Like, pair plus draw doesn't always qualify. If you've got like ace-2 suited and you raise pre-flop and get called, and you go to the flop with top pair with no kicker but not flush draw, very often you're not gonna have that much incentive to be aggressive. I mean, that might be, or even like second pair with a reasonable kicker plus a draw. There's spots where you should be betting that kind of hand, but there's definitely other spots where you shouldn't. If your opponent is very aggressive, well, I mean, that would, I guess, still qualify because the line would pull that in towards center where you're going to play it for its showdown value. I digress. I think we want to kind of keep this video a little bit separate from the rest of the OPP stuff. So your major categories of draw are going to be naked flush draw, naked straight draw, and I could have done open-ended straight draw, double gut shot, and gut shot, but I think just naked straight draw is good enough. Backdoor draw, combo draw, and I could have done combo draw as pair plus draw or straight flush draw or something like that, like divided it up and subdivided it. I mean, you can divide and subdivide and subdivide and subdivide until you get to the to as many categories as there are hands that you could conceivably hold. But I think these are pretty good ways to kind of split everything up. The one thing maybe I should have done is broken up combo draw as pair plus draw and like straight flush draw, because pair plus draw and straight flush draw actually play differently. But right now we're not talking about pair plus draw, but we could well be talking about a straight draw. So the basic qualitative difference between a draw and any other major part of a range that you're going to have is exactly its lack of showdown value but high equity versus even the strongest parts of your opponent's range. So you see why pair plus draw doesn't qualify, because a pair plus a draw has showdown value, and it's not going to lose to ace high at showdown, right? It still has good equity against even the strongest parts of your opponent's range most of the time, but that's the draw part. But really, it is the lack of showdown value in a draw that puts it on the right hand of showdown value on Navinad's line, and that line just, again, it shows on the poles you've got incentive to aggress, and in the middle you don't. Well, where does the incentive to get aggressive with a draw come from? And it comes primarily from its lack of showdown value. Because when you're making a bet or a raise, the idea is you want to get called by worse hands, or you want to fold out better hands. But when we're talking about better and worse hands, what we're talking about is how often they're going to win at showdown, their showdown value. So if we look at draws from the perspective of basic bet theory, I think that's going to help us to get our heads around how we play draws, or what the best way to play draws in any given spot is going to be. And what is basic bet theory? Basic bet theory is the more aggressive I get, the more my opponents fold, and the stronger their ranges become. Because the idea here is like, and when I say the more aggressive I become, that can be the bigger I size my bet, or it can also be the more streets that I get aggressive across. I mean, both of those things are going to have higher aggression. Like if I bet half the pot on the flop, or if I bet 1.5 times the pot on the flop, that should have a different effect to my opponent's range. The effect on my opponent's range should be the smaller I bet, the fewer hands they fold, and the wider their range remains. Whereas the bigger I bet, the more of my opponent's hands fold, and the stronger their continuing range that's left over becomes. And the idea is that you're going to do this yourself, and you're going to expect that your opponents are going to fold the worst hands in their range ahead of folding the best hands in their range. So just like if I bet small on the flop, that's not going to have the same effect as betting big on the flop. If I bet flop and turn, that's going to have more of a drastic effect, a range reducing and range strengthening effect, than just like betting the flop and checking the turn. So basic bet theory doesn't necessarily have to distinguish between making a very big bet on the flop and making two bets that are of about the same impact across two different streets. I mean, it does there is a distinction there, of course, but I think we can just sum it up and keep it pretty simple and still very effective. And I think the simpler and more effective it is, the more efficient it is. Like, efficiency is something like a measurement of the ratio between effectiveness and simplicity. I just came up with that. You like that? There's Navinad theorem. People have asked me about that. Do I have like a Navinad theorem? Or actually, I guess a person has asked me about that. But people have talked to me about it. So there's my Navinad theorem. Efficiency, a definition for efficiency. So basic bet theory, the way that we want to look at basic bet theory is this is a lens to view all of No Limit Hold'em through. I mean, this is what you're doing. So when you have a really strong hand, you can pile a bunch of money in without overplaying that really big hand. Like when you've got top set on a relatively dry board, if it's the nuts, there's like nothing you can do to really overplay your hand, because there isn't a way to turn that hand into a bluff. No matter how much you bet, there's no way to fold out. There's no way to cause your opponent to fold all of the hands that you beat and continue with only the hands that beat you, because nothing beats you. So when you've got a very strong hand, you've got good incentive to get very aggressive, because you build a strong pot against the good, really strong second best hands in your opponent's range. So having the nut value hands in your range, that's what they're good at. They're good at stacking the second nut hands in your opponent's range. Having bluffs in your range, what are they good at? They're good at, you still have cards and you're still able to bet, and that will still take out some of your opponent's range. So the no showdown value hands, the bluffs in your range, what they're good at is getting your opponent to fold the not so good hands in their range that would still beat you an awful lot at showdown. Then the showdown value hands in your range, what are they good at? Well, they're good at getting to showdown and being the best hand against a wide range. And some of your showdown value hands or bluff catchers are just not going to be the best hand very often if they bet and get called, but they could still be the best hand if they check and face a bet, because the way that money goes into the pot matters. If I check the flop, let's say I'm pre-flop raiser, villain checks, I'm in position, I check back, now I have incentivized my opponent to bluff while keeping his range wide, because I didn't make a bet that knocked out the weakest hands in his range. So you can look at everything through this lens and it becomes more clear, I think. This is a very important and useful tool that will help you conceptualize how to play all hands, and draws especially. So what is the implication here? Or what are the implications? Basically, if we've got a draw, we have no real showdown value to speak of right here, right now. We're going to lose an awful lot of the time if we let our opponent's hand get to showdown, because almost any hand in his range is going to have a decent chunk of equity against our draws. I mean, ace high will beat us if we don't improve. And we've got a naked flush draw, we're going to only improve about a third of the time. So ace high beats our naked flush draw most of the time if we let it get to showdown. So it's a big problem. It's a big, most of the time it's a really bad idea to allow your opponent to get their weak hands to showdown when you've got a perfectly good draw that you could use to get aggressive and force your opponent to either have a hand or fold. And the other end of this is we still have reasonable equity even against the strong parts of our opponent's range. So if we have a hand that is going to play about the same, I mean roughly the same, it's going to be a lot closer than most hands to playing the same against the strongest parts of our opponent's range and the weakest parts of our opponent's range. I mean, we're going to lose to even their bottom pairs and their ace highs and just their live cards a pretty high percent of the time if we play passively. But if we get aggressive, or if they get aggressive, or if we both get aggressive, we're going to beat even the stronger hands, the strongest parts of our opponent's range or our opponent's ranges, a relatively or a reasonably high percent of the time. So this is different than second pair, right? Like if we get aggressive with second pair, we're folding out all the hands that we could beat, and we're narrowing our opponent's range to include basically just hands that have us beat. But draws are not like that, and that's what gives them a lot of their incentive to become aggressive. That's where a lot of the value of a semi-bluff comes from. So these draws should be the first hands in our range that get shifted into the bluff category to balance our aggression. Now, is that always the case? No, that's not always the case. Sometimes we can't just bluff all of our draws, but and we'll get to that. But if we're going to have bluffs in our range, the very first spot we should look for them is we should look for whatever semi-bluffs we might have in a given range. We should use those to bluff with. I mean, what does the perfect bluff look like? If we have a lot of incentive to get aggressive, and that would be something like we're going to lose often if we let our opponent's range get to showdown, and we've got a lot of equity when we do get called, so it's like even if they do happen, even if we run into it, we're far from dead. That's something like the perfect bluff, right? That's the best hand to get aggressive with under a lot of circumstances. It's just like the worst hands that our opponent has can still beat us. What should we do? We should bet, the worst hands in our opponent's range that will easily fold, like even like the king high and the queen. Say we've got jack 10 suited and we've got a straight flush draw, like even queen high. If our opponent has queen high and is just going to give up, he's ready to give up. and we're just like, we're just going to play passively. If we play our draw passively against queen high, that queen high beats us like half the time at showdown. There's no way it doesn't fold to a bet, right? So if the worst hands in our opponent's range will beat us pretty often, but the strongest hands in our opponent's range will lose to us fairly often, well, what do you think we ought to do about that? And the answer is generally we should get aggressive, right? I mean, that's usually going to be the answer. However, it's not always going to be the answer. Okay, should we always get just mindlessly aggressive every time we have a draw? I mean, no, but you could do a lot worse. The problem is, the problem is HUDs. Heads-up displays are really the problem, or poker players' memories. Sometimes we are going to have a more balanced range than that. I mean, in a vacuum, semi-bluffs are generally going to be very profitable. But just because we have a flush draw on the flop doesn't always mean we should get aggressive with it, because some of the time we're going to need to be able to represent flushes on later streets when we've taken a line that's not not aggressive. So let me give you an example here. If we're playing heads up, if I'm playing heads up against you, and this is one of the things that I pay the most attention to because it's one of the easiest places to get a really big, like, ball breaking, you're never gonna beat me kind of edge against your opponent when you're playing heads up, is exactly this phenomenon that like, if your opponent always bets when they have a flush draw, like every time they're out of position, if they flop a flush draw, they check and raise, and every time they're in position and they have a flush draw, if you check, they bet, then if the flop comes out two-tone and your opponent either just check calls, or if they're in position, they check back, then on the turn, when that third card that completes the obvious draws comes in, your opponent never has that draw. So if your opponent always gets aggressive with their flush draws on the flop, and in a given hand there's an open flush draw on the flop and your opponent doesn't get aggressive, then when that third card of that suit hits the turn, it's free lunch, man. You know that your opponent can't have that flush, so he's capped his range in a nasty way, and you can really take advantage of that by just piling money in against him with the weaker parts of your range and the strongest parts of your range. There's nothing he can do about it. I mean, he's really put himself in a bad spot, or you've put him in a bad spot by paying attention to his tendencies and exploiting them correctly. So one more time, in case that's not very clear or if it's kind of complicated. If every time I flop a flush draw, I get aggressive with it, but in this hand, I'm not aggressive, and there's two spades on the flop, I check back, or I call your bet, and then the third spade comes on the turn, then I don't have a flush. I don't have any flushes in my range. And if my range is capped that hard, and you know that, then you can take the worst hands in your range and just abuse me. And then you just have to balance that by putting the value hands in your range also. And I've put myself into this terrible polar versus bluff catcher situation where I'm playing the bluff catcher, and I've allowed you to polarize perfectly against me and really just put me in the vice, and just put me in the nutcracker, the ball breaker. So we need to have draws in our passive ranges so that we have good board coverage when we do take a passive line and the draw comes in. That's a concern only against players that are paying attention. But the other end of that is players that are not paying attention. We're not going to have the most fold equity against those kinds of opponents anyway. So there is a reason to slow down with some of our semi-bluffs and just kind of focus in on the semi part and ignore the bluff part. And because we don't want to be in a spot where we're over bluffing, and if we're betting all of our draws on the super wet board, then we're over bluffing. And we've kind of talked a little bit about why we don't want to over bluff, because then when we're passive in a spot where we might want to semi bluff, then our opponent can put us in a bad spot when we, like, say the draws come in and we don't have any of them in our range. The other end of that spectrum, or the other side of that coin, against a good player, a good thinking opponent with a good heads-up display working, or a memory or a brain, can also take advantage of us over bluffing on wet board textures by just calling down light against us, or otherwise getting pretty aggressive. And like if he knows that we're going to semi bluff at every opportunity, and we raise say from, like, I don't know, middle position, and the big blind calls, and the flop comes out like 9 of spades, 8 of spades, 6 of diamonds, and he checks and we bet. If he knows that we're gonna just like really be betting all of our straight draws, all of our overpairs, all of our flush draws, and some number of other hands, we're too merged. And if we're too merged, we're just going to have a weak range that can't stand a lot of pressure. And our opponent, especially if they have a range advantage, which I think in the situation I laid out just now, it probably does, he can just check raise for value very thin, and check raise a balanced range and a polarized range with a lot of bluffs and a lot of value hands and put us in a bad spot. We're not going to go into the details of the game theory end of that, right? I mean, I guess I kind of did, but I guess that's as far as I want to go with that. Just suffice to say, we shouldn't typically want to overbluff, because if we're against a good player, he's going to be able to beat us up. He's going to be able to punish us for overbluffing, both when we're aggressive in a spot where we have a lot of bluffs in our range, and when we're not aggressive, and then the would-be semi-bluffs in our range come in, and our range is severely capped. And we shouldn't want to be over-bluffing against bad players either, because bad players, the primary mistake propensity, the main mistake that bad players typically make is they call too often. And so those are just really good reasons to think like we have to be somewhat selective when it comes to semi-bluffing. Okay, like we don't want to just semi-bluff 100% of the time. And I could do an entire video on just, maybe I will at some point, do an entire video on which draws to get aggressive with and which draws to not be aggressive with. But I mean, in general, like if you're playing fast fold anonymous poker, just bluff the shit out of your flush draws. If you're playing against a reasonable but not that good player, you know, like a not fish, like a bad rag, I don't know, like microstakes, bad rag, beat the shit out of them, semi-bluff them to pieces. But when you get into like NL50, you gotta be careful. You know, NL25 even, some of the regs, or heads up against like, well, heads up at frickin' any stake above maybe $5. You've got to be a little bit, you got to pay a little bit of attention to this. Some of our opponents just aren't gonna fold often enough to make the bluff part of the semi-bluff plus EV. It's not going to add enough on balance to the effectiveness of our line, and those are going to be typically the worst opponents, and then the best opponents are going to be able to beat us up for being imbalanced. So it only really leaves this little in-between group of players, like bad rags or reasonable fish, you know, that kind of area where our semi-bluffs are just going to be crazy good. And you know, I know that if your brain kind of shut down and you didn't listen to much of what I just said, and I know it's complicated, or if you just kind of got stuck in your own thought process, and you're like, no, fuck that, I know how good semi-bluffs are. I talked to one of my, I think, better students last night. We had a conversation about this very topic, and he said something like what's in quotes over here. It's like, yeah, but you know, if I bet my draw, I'm going to get folds a lot, and then the hands that continue are going to be stronger, and that's going to increase my implied odds, and so then I'm going to have good implied odds. I'm still going to have the lead in the hand. I'm going to have good fold equity, and I either have to have good fold equity or good implied odds. And Navinat, you've told me that yourself many times, that there's this reverse correlation between implied odds and fold equity, yada yada, so on and so forth, and that's all fair, you know, it's all good and well. And my answer to that is, yeah, man, like your semi-bluffs are definitely going to be plus EV, no question about it. Like you can't add fold equity and hand equity and implied odds. You can't add all that together and not come up with a plus EV line, or you're doing something pretty bad. But remember that your equity doesn't just vanish if you elect to not get aggressive. And your implied odds don't either. I mean, it might feel like they do, because in a given hand, if you're getting aggressive, then your opponent's folding all of the hands that aren't super strong. But in this hand right here, right now, your opponent either has a strong hand or he doesn't. And if he does have that strong hand, then very literally you still do have good implied odds. So if you make your hand, if you're playing passively, once you make your hand, you're still going to get to pile in a bunch of money. And although you're going to get folds out of a lot of the range that's left in against you, that small percent of your opponent's range that's very strong and is going to go broke to your draws when they get there, that's still in their range. It's still in there. You didn't fold it out. This isn't the same as trying to look at the weak hands that are no longer there when we've taken an aggressive line. When we take a passive line, that doesn't get rid of the strong hands in our opponent's range in any way. It just changes the percent of the range that's left. It can change that ratio, but that's not really as important as it might feel like it is or seem at first glance. Like, if you get to a spot where you're like, okay, I need to play some of my draws more passively, and then you check back and your opponent bets and you call, and then you brick the turn but you bink the river, and you're thinking like, wow, if I would have like rammed and jammed, then my opponent would only have like his really good hands and I'd be able to bust him right here. But the other end of that is, if you had rammed and jammed, you would have folded all of his bluffs out, and maybe you just got bluffed on the turn and you actually made more money by leaving his weak hands in his range until you had a chance to improve. Plus, if he is bluffing, maybe that third heart that comes in on the river looks like a really good card for him to continue barreling on, and he's bluffing your improvement cards. So first of all, that can go both ways. But the other thing is in this exact hand right here, right now, he either has that hand that can go bust against you, or he doesn't. And it's still in his range. You didn't do anything to get rid of it. You just kind of changed the percent chance of this exact moment. Good Lord, sorry about all the noise. The other thing is, we can look at this argument. We could say, yeah, this is a very good argument about, well, I mean, I wrote down kind of a parody of the argument, but you could make a very good argument along these lines for how effective it is to semi-bluff, but that would not prove that you should semi-bluff, because you can't just compare the equity, or I'm sorry, the EV of semi-bluffing to the EV of standing up and walking away from the table or throwing your cards into the muck. Your equity doesn't vanish just because you just decide to not get aggressive. Just your fold equity does, right? And your implied odds, even though it might feel like you're hurting yourself in terms of implied odds, that's kind of an illusion. It's not exactly the case, and hopefully I've explained that well enough. And so we shouldn't compare the EV of semi-bluffing to the EV of just tossing our draw into the muck. We should compare the EV of a semi-bluff to the EV of taking a different line against another, a different line against a different opponent or in a different situation, and compare all of that like to how it's going to affect our overall strategy, our strategy at large. So in conclusion, this is the term I came up with today while I was writing this slide. I'm pretty happy about it. I think I'm going to start using this. So that's now Navinad theorem. Okay. Draws have chunky equity. You like it? It's kind of like taking a set mine. The nice thing, like people try to look at pocket pairs and are like, well, pre-flop my pocket pair is 50% equity against 2 overcards, but that's not usually very relevant. I mean, it is if you're playing short stacked, but usually you're either going to like smash the flop or you're going to whiff the flop when you take a set mine, right? And that's the beauty of a set mine, is that it has this chunky equity. And that chunky equity means you're never going to make real big mistakes, or you're rarely going to make mistakes. Like you're going to either hit the flop and know exactly what to do, or you're going to miss the flop and know exactly what to do. Whereas a lot of other hands are going to leave you in no man's land, not really knowing what to do a pretty high percent of the time. Like your, Jack 10s, Queen Jacks, King Queen offsuit type hands aren't going to have this chunky equity. They're going to flop like these King Queen offsuit type hands, and these even like Ace 10 suited type hands. Their equity is going to be dispersed more evenly across a larger percent of boards. But a thing like the thing about taking a set mine is it's got this chunky equity that is going to make it hard for you to make mistakes post flop, because you're going to know that you flopped the set and you should try to get it in, or like just play very aggressively, or you're going to know that you whiffed and you don't have shit for a hand and you're not going to lose a bunch of money. The same thing kind of applies to draws. Draws have this chunky equity that is going to be it's not going to have like 50% equity on every street, right? It's just, or even if it's a 38% equity hand, it's not going to have 30% equity across every street. It's not going to just have like a terrible decision every time your opponent bets half pot on flop, turn, and river. At some point it's either going to get there or it's not going to get there. So you're going to know better how to play than your opponent will. If you take a free card, if you choose to check and just take one off to try to hit your draw for coverage or against the calling station or whatever, you're going to know you're going to know what that turn is before you have to make any big decisions, and you're going to be in a better position to take advantage of that knowledge than your opponent would be with like top pair with a weak kicker, or any hand that's not a draw really. So this chunky equity creates a situation where we lose to weak hands fairly often, and we beat strong hands reasonably often. And we're going to know when that happens. That's important. And really it means that we should often play draws very aggressively, because we've got a lot of incentive to fold out even the shitty hands in the range. And we do okay against the strongest hands that it leaves behind. But not always. Sometimes our draw has better implied odds and worse fold equity. We're against the calling station. And sometimes we should just shut the bluff part down and stick to the semi part for board coverage, to not over bluff, to make sure that we're not super capped if we take a passive line and then all the draws get there and we can never win the pot, right? So hopefully that was a little bit of a welcome break from the I think a little bit tedious job of trying to explain how to play poker from scratch. But until next time, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave comments, like. Coaching is not, I don't know, I'll have to make some decisions here in the near future about like how big of a part of my life I want coaching to be. But get a hold of me. Let me know how much demand there is for it out there, so I can make some good decisions in the future. Off topic. Sorry, guys. Till next time. Navinad on No Limit Hold'em. Good quote. LUCK exclamation point end quote.